The silence in the grand kitchen was deafening. For months, the cook had wiped away silent tears behind a stoic smile, her hands tirelessly preparing meals that no one thanked her for. Tonight, the room held no warmth, only shadows cast by the cold chandelier hanging above the marble island. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're preparing dinner for someone who won't even thank you, or washing dishes while everyone else sleeps. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. In a sprawling penthouse overlooking Chicago's magnificent skyline, Clara Martinez stirred a pot of her signature beef stew at 5:30 in the morning. The kitchen gleamed with state-of-the-art appliances worth more than most people's annual salaries. A sub-zero refrigerator that hummed quietly, commercial-grade Viking ranges that could feed a restaurant, granite countertops that stretched like frozen lakes under the recessed lighting. Yet despite all this luxury, the space felt as cold as the November wind rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows. From down the polished hallway came the distant echo of a grandfather clock chiming the half-hour, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet of the 42nd floor. Clara wasn't a trained chef with culinary school credentials or Michelin stars to her name. She was a woman of 53, her weathered hands telling stories of decades spent in service to others. Her cooking came from somewhere deeper than technique. It flowed from memories of her grandmother's kitchen in Little Village, where the smell of masa and chilies had filled their tiny apartment, where love was measured in spoonfuls, and comfort came in the form of perfectly seasoned black beans. Every morning, she arrived at this glass tower before dawn, taking the service elevator to the penthouse where Edward Whitmore III lived in gilded isolation. The old man, heir to a shipping fortune estimated at over $200 million, owned properties across 3 states and held investment portfolios that included everything from blue-chip stocks to cryptocurrency. His wealth was legendary in Chicago's social circles, but his table was empty of the one thing money couldn't purchase: genuine warmth. Clara had discovered Edward collapsed in his study 8 months ago, his medications scattered across Persian rugs worth more than her childhood home. The family had hired her initially as a live-in caregiver, a decision made by his grandson Michael during a brief visit between business trips to Hong Kong and Dubai. "Just keep him alive until we sort out the estate," Michael had said with the casual coldness of someone accustomed to treating people like line items on a balance sheet. But Clara saw something different in Edward's roomy blue eyes, a loneliness so profound it seemed to echo through the marble halls of his domain. She began cooking for him, really cooking, the way her abuela had taught her, with intention, with memory, with the understanding that food was love made visible. The transformation happened gradually, like seasons changing. Edward, who had been surviving on catered meals that arrived in sterile white boxes, began to show up in the kitchen doorway around dinner time. At first, he just watched silently as Clara diced onions with the rhythm of decades of practice, her knife work efficient and sure. The kitchen filled with aromas that spoke of home, cumin and oregano, the sweet caramelization of onions, the rich depth of browned garlic. "What are you making now?" he had asked in his gravelly voice, and Clara would explain in her soft, accented English, sharing not just ingredients, but stories. The pozole reminded her of Christmas mornings with cousins crowded around her grandmother's table. The cornbread spoke of Sunday afternoons when money was tight, but love was abundant. Slowly, the old man began to smile again, his appetite returning along with a spark in his eyes that his fortune had never been able to kindle. But Clara's invisible contributions were written in disappearing ink. No one acknowledged the way she had nursed Edward through pneumonia the previous winter, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, spooning homemade caldo de pollo into his mouth when he was too weak to lift his head. The financial advisors and estate lawyers who paraded through the penthouse saw only an aging Hispanic woman in a simple apron, someone to be worked around, not someone whose gentle care had pulled their client back from the edge of despair. The chef's apron she wore, plain white cotton purchased with her own modest wages, became her uniform of invisibility, marking her as help, not family, despite the fact that Edward had come to depend on her presence more than his monthly dividend statements or his accountant's reports on his diversified investment portfolio. The humiliation began on a crisp October morning when Michael Whitmore arrived from New York with a leather briefcase full of legal documents and a demeanor colder than Lake Michigan's winter winds. At 38, he was everything his grandfather's fortune could produce. Harvard MBA, corner office overlooking Wall Street, a portfolio of his own approaching 8 figures through aggressive stock market investments and early Bitcoin purchases that had paid off spectacularly. He swept into the penthouse like a corporate takeover, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished marble floors as he surveyed his anticipated inheritance with calculating eyes. Clara was arranging fresh flowers in the foyer when he arrived, her calloused hands gentle on the chrysanthemums she'd bought from her own grocery money, because she believed Edward deserved beauty in his daily surroundings. "You must be the help," Michael said, not bothering to introduce himself as he breezed past her toward his grandfather's study. The dismissal in his voice was casual, practiced, the way someone might acknowledge a piece of furniture. Clara knew better than to correct him, to explain that she was the one who had memorized Edward's medication schedule, who knew he preferred his coffee at exactly 7:15 each morning, who had learned to read the subtle changes in his breathing that meant his arthritis was flaring. She simply nodded and continued arranging the flowers, their golden petals bright against the stark white of the Italian marble vase. A splash of warmth in the cold perfection of the penthouse. Over the following days, Michael's presence transformed the atmosphere of the home. He brought with him a parade of estate planners, tax attorneys, and financial advisors, all sharp suits and sharper briefcases, transforming Edward's quiet sanctuary into a bustling office. They spread documents across the dining room table where Clara had served countless intimate dinners, their discussions of tax shelters and offshore accounts drowning out the gentle conversations she and Edward had shared over her homemade tres leches cake. "We need to streamline operations," Michael announced during one of these meetings, his voice carrying clearly to the kitchen where Clara was preparing Edward's afternoon snack. "Cut unnecessary expenses. This place runs like a small hotel. And frankly, some of the current arrangements are excessive." The first cuts were subtle. The fresh flower deliveries stopped. The premium coffee Edward loved was replaced with a cheaper brand. Clara's grocery budget was slashed, forcing her to stretch meals with less expensive ingredients while maintaining the nutritional balance Edward's doctor had recommended. She adapted quietly, the way she had learned to adapt to every challenge life had thrown at her, finding ways to create abundance from scarcity. She shopped at ethnic markets in Pilsen, where her Spanish served her well and prices were reasonable, crafting meals that were humble in cost but rich in flavor and care. But the message was clear. She was expendable, a luxury the estate could no longer afford. The attacks on her dignity became more direct as Michael settled into his role as the penthouse's new authority. "Anyone can boil rice and beans," he told her one morning as she prepared Edward's breakfast, his voice dripping with the condescension of someone who had never missed a meal in his life. "But real cooking? That's an art form that requires training, technique, proper credentials. You're certainly trying your best with what you know." Clara continued whisking eggs for Edward's omelet, her movements steady despite the sting of his words. She thought of her grandmother, who had fed 12 grandchildren with nothing but love and creativity, whose hands had turned the humblest ingredients into feasts that nourished both body and soul. She thought of the decades she had spent in other people's kitchens, invisible hands creating the meals that brought families together, that celebrated holidays and comforted sorrows. The servants in the building began to whisper, "She's not really qualified for this kind of position," she heard the doorman tell a delivery person. "These people need professional staff, not someone picked up from a day labor center." The words cut deep because Clara understood them all too well. She had worked as a house cleaner, a nanny, a caregiver, moving from family to family as children grew up or elderly charges passed away. Her resume was written in other people's memories, in the meals she had cooked and the care she had provided, invisible contributions to lives that continued long after she moved on. But even as the deliberate humiliations mounted, Clara found an unexpected source of strength. Edward's 8-year-old great-granddaughter, Emily, arrived for a 2-week visit while her parents sorted out their divorce proceedings. The little girl wandered into the kitchen on her first afternoon, drawn by the smell of chocolate chip cookies cooling on wire racks. "Can I help?" she asked with the innocent directness of childhood, her small face peering over the marble island. Clara's heart, worn down by months of indifference, bloomed at the child's genuine interest. Together, they created magic in that sterile kitchen. Emily learned to measure flour and crack eggs, her small hands guided by Clara's patient touch. "Real cooking isn't about fancy tools or expensive ingredients," Clara told her as they rolled out pie dough one rainy afternoon. "It's about putting your heart into what you make, about cooking with intention and love." Emily absorbed these lessons like a sponge, her laughter echoing off the high ceilings as she created lopsided empanadas that tasted like pure joy. In the child's presence, Clara remembered why she cooked, not for recognition or praise, but for the simple pleasure of nourishing another human being. Their afternoon cooking sessions became a bright spot in Clara's increasingly difficult days. Emily would race from her online tutoring sessions straight to the kitchen, eager to learn new recipes and hear Clara's stories about her childhood in Mexico, about her grandmother's restaurant that had fed 3 generations of families in their small town outside Guadalajara. "Tell me about the mole again," Emily would beg, and Clara would describe the complex sauce with its 23 ingredients, each one adding its voice to a symphony of flavor that took 3 days to perfect. Through Emily's wonder, Clara rediscovered the magic in her own skills, the artistry she had never given herself credit for possessing. Michael's solution to what he saw as his grandfather's decline arrived on a gray December morning in the form of Chef Philippe Laurent, a French culinary artist whose Chicago restaurant had earned 2 Michelin stars and whose services commanded $5,000 per private dinner. Philippe swept into the kitchen like a conquering general, his knife roll worth more than Clara's monthly salary, his resume glittering with awards from culinary competitions around the world. "We'll finally have proper cuisine in this house," Michael announced as he introduced the chef, his pride evident as he listed Philippe's credentials and the famous clients who competed for reservations at his restaurant. Clara was relegated to prep work and cleaning, invisible hands chopping vegetables for dishes she would never be credited with creating. Felipe's cooking was undeniably skilled. His sauces were perfectly balanced, his presentation worthy of magazine covers, his technique flawless in every detail. But something was missing from his creations, some essential element that Clara couldn't quite name. Edward picked at the elaborate meals, his appetite diminishing despite the obvious artistry on his plate. "It's very nice," he would say politely when Philippe asked for his opinion, but Clara noticed he barely finished half of each expensive dish. The kitchen became Philippe's domain, and Clara felt increasingly like an intruder in the space she had made her own. The French chef's temperament matched his reputation for perfectionism, and he made no effort to hide his disdain for what he considered Clara's peasant cooking. "This is how real professionals work," he would say loudly, as he demonstrated knife techniques to the building's other staff members, his voice carrying clearly to where Clara scrubbed pots in the corner. Proper French technique, classical training, not some amateur fumbling around with ethnic food. The words stung because Clara knew her limitations. She had no formal training, no certificates on her wall, no reviews in prestigious food magazines. What she had was 53 years of feeding people with love, but that currency held no value in Felipe's world. The final humiliation came on a night when Philippe was preparing a birthday dinner for one of Edward's few remaining friends, a meal that would cost more than Clara earned in a month. She was washing dishes when she knocked over a small container of saffron, the precious spice scattering across the floor like golden snow, worth hundreds of dollars and impossible to salvage. Felipe's reaction was immediate and volcanic. "This is what happens when you let amateurs in a professional kitchen," he shouted, his face red with fury. "This woman has no business being here. She's a liability, a danger to proper culinary standards." Michael appeared within minutes, drawn by the commotion, his expression already set in judgment before he heard the facts. The scattered saffron formed a damning golden circle on the pristine floor, expensive evidence of Clara's supposed incompetence. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, kneeling to gather the irreplaceable spice with trembling hands, knowing that no amount of apology could undo the damage to both the ingredient and her reputation. "It was an accident. I'll pay for it." But Michael was already beyond reason, his frustration with his grandfather's condition and his own guilt finding a convenient target in the woman whose only crime was caring too much. "You're finished here," Michael declared, his voice cold with the authority of inherited wealth and corporate power. "We can't have this kind of carelessness, this level of unprofessionalism in grandfather's home. You'll be paid through the end of the week, but we need you gone by tomorrow morning." Clara looked around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary. At the copper pots she had seasoned with care, at the herb garden on the windowsill that she had planted and tended through the autumn months. 8 months of her life, of genuine care and devotion, dismissed in an instant over a spilled spice that could be replaced with a phone call and a credit card. Emily appeared in the doorway as Clara was packing her few personal belongings, the child's face streaked with tears as she witnessed the injustice unfolding in her safe haven. "Where are you going?" she asked, her small voice breaking on the words. Clara knelt to hug her, breathing in the sweet scent of the child's hair, memorizing the moment because she knew it would be their last. "Sometimes adults make difficult decisions," Clara said gently, not wanting to poison the little girl's mind against her family. "But I want you to remember what we learned together, okay? Cooking is about love, not about being perfect." Emily clung to her, her small body shaking with sobs that echoed the grief in Clara's own heart. That night, Clara removed her apron for the last time, the simple white cotton fabric heavy in her hands like a flag of surrender. She looked around the kitchen once more, at the Viking ranges that would now serve only Felipe's technical perfection, at the marble island where she and Emily had rolled out countless cookies, at the window that looked out over Chicago's glittering skyline. 8 months of her love lingered invisibly in every corner, in the seasoning that coated the cast-iron skillets, in the recipes she had quietly taught the kitchen staff, in the warmth that had slowly transformed this sterile space into something resembling a home. Tomorrow, she would take the service elevator down 42 floors and walk out into the cold Chicago morning, carrying nothing but the knowledge that she had given her best to people who had ultimately found her unworthy of their trust. The penthouse began to change almost immediately after Clara's departure, though the transformation was subtle at first, like a house slowly losing heat through microscopic cracks in its windows. Felipe's meals continued to arrive on schedule, each one a masterpiece of culinary technique that photographed beautifully under the dining room's crystal chandelier. The plates were returned to the kitchen nearly empty, scraped clean in accordance with proper etiquette, but something fundamental had shifted in the household's rhythm. Edward began pushing food around his plate with increasing frequency, his appetite diminishing despite his doctor's concerns about maintaining his weight. "Is everything prepared to your satisfaction, Mr. Whitmore?" Felipe would ask with professional concern, and Edward would nod politely, offering the same diplomatic response. "Yes, very nice, thank you." But in the quiet hours when the penthouse settled into its evening routine, Edward found himself wandering into the kitchen like a ghost, drawn to a place where he had once felt alive. The space looked exactly the same gleaming appliances, the same spotless granite countertops, the same view of Chicago's skyline stretching toward the dark waters of Lake Michigan. Yet, everything felt different. Sterile in a way that went beyond Felipe's obsessive cleanliness standards. The warmth that had gradually seeped into the room during Clara's tenure had evaporated like steam from a forgotten pot, leaving behind only the cold perfection of a showroom display. Michael noticed his grandfather's decline, but attributed it to the natural progression of age and the Chicago winter's harsh grip on elderly bones. "Perhaps we should consider increasing his medication," he suggested to Edward's physician during a routine visit, pulling out his phone to check stock prices while the doctor examined his patient. The old man's weight had dropped 8 pounds in 2 weeks, and his sleep patterns had become irregular, nocturnal wanderings that worried the night security staff. "It's probably just adjustment," Michael reasoned with the casual authority of someone accustomed to solving problems with money and executive decisions. "Philippe's cooking is world-class. Grandfather should be thriving on proper nutrition for the first time in months." The household staff began to whisper among themselves, conversations conducted in hushed tones as they went about their duties. Maria, the housekeeper who had worked in the building for 15 years, noticed that Mr. Whitmore had stopped humming the old songs that had become his habit while Clara lived there. James, the concierge, observed that the elderly man no longer asked about the weather or showed interest in the small talk that had once punctuated their daily interactions. Even the building's doorman mentioned that Edward's morning walks had become shorter, more perfunctory, lacking the purpose that had characterized his movements when he would stop at the corner market to buy ingredients for Clara's afternoon cooking sessions. Philippe, confident in his culinary supremacy, remained oblivious to the household's shifting dynamics. His meals were technical marvels, perfectly balanced flavors, innovative presentations, textures that played across the palate like symphonic compositions. He had transformed the kitchen into his personal stage, filling it with the tools and ingredients of his trade, molecular gastronomy equipment, rare spices imported at enormous expense, wines that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. "This is how a proper kitchen should function," he told visitors who came to marvel at his creations, gesturing toward the arsenal of professional equipment with obvious pride. Precision, technique, excellence in every detail. But Emily noticed what the adults missed. During her weekend visits, she would slip into the kitchen searching for the warmth she had found there with Clara, only to discover a space that felt foreign despite its familiar appearance. The herb garden on the windowsill had withered without Clara's daily attention, the small clay pots now holding only brown stems and dried soil. The cookie jar sat empty on the counter, a ceramic reminder of afternoon cooking sessions that had ended with laughter and flour-dusted aprons. "Where are the cookies?" she asked Philippe one Saturday morning, her 8-year-old directness cutting through the chef's professional composure. He looked down at her with the puzzled expression of someone unused to children's questions. "We don't make cookies here," he replied with French precision. "This is a serious kitchen, not a playground." Edward's great-granddaughter began spending her visits in her room, no longer drawn to the kitchen that had once been her favorite place in the penthouse. Michael, busy with his own financial empire and the complex task of managing his grandfather's estate, attributed her withdrawal to the divorce proceedings between her parents. "Children are resilient," he assured himself, and anyone who expressed concern, the same way he dismissed his grandfather's declining appetite as a minor medical issue that could be resolved with the right pharmaceutical intervention or perhaps a consultation with another specialist. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening in late December when Edward sat at his dining room table, staring at a plate of Philippe's latest creation, duck breast with cherry gastrique, accompanied by microgreens and an artful drizzle of reduced balsamic that had been aged in oak barrels for 12 years. The presentation was flawless, the technique beyond reproach, the cost astronomical enough to feed a small family for a week. But after 3 bites, Edward set down his silverware and looked out at the Chicago skyline, his rheumy eyes reflecting the city lights like tears he could no longer shed. "Where is she?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying across the marble expanse of the dining room to where Michael sat reviewing quarterly reports on his tablet. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with meaning and loss. "I'm sorry, grandfather." "Where is who?" Michael replied without looking up from his screen, his attention divided between his grandfather's words and an urgent email from his Hong Kong office about cryptocurrency investments that required immediate attention. "The warmth," Edward whispered, and for the first time in months his grandson lifted his eyes from the glowing screen to really look at the old man. Edward's face had acquired a transparency that spoke of something deeper than physical decline. A spiritual emptiness that no amount of money could fill, no investment portfolio could cure. Where is the warmth in this house? Where is the woman who knew how to cook with her heart? The questions echoed through the dining room, bouncing off marble surfaces and crystal fixtures that suddenly seemed less like luxury and more like a beautiful prison. That night, Michael found himself unable to sleep, his mind circling back to his grandfather's words like a moth drawn to flame. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his guest room, looking out at the city lights that sparkled like earthbound stars, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to think about Clara. He remembered her quiet presence in the kitchen, the way his grandfather's face had changed during her tenure, the subtle transformation from isolated billionaire to something approaching a contented man. The financial reports and estate planning documents suddenly felt inadequate, insufficient tools for measuring what truly mattered in the closing chapters of a human life. Michael began making phone calls the next morning, using the same executive persistence that had built his fortune to track down a woman whose last name he had never bothered to learn. The task proved more difficult than acquiring companies or negotiating million-dollar deals, because Clara had left no forwarding address, no contact information beyond the personnel file that listed an emergency contact in Pilsen. His private investigator, accustomed to finding hidden assets and investigating investment fraud, found himself challenged by the humility of Clara's life. She had no social media presence, no digital footprint beyond basic employment records, no paper trail of the kind that wealth inevitably leaves behind. The breakthrough came through Emily, whose 8-year-old determination proved more effective than professional investigators and corporate resources. "I remember she talked about a place where she helped people," the little girl told her great-uncle during one of their weekend visits. She said she went there on Sundays to cook soup for families who didn't have enough money for groceries. It was in the neighborhood where she grew up, where people spoke Spanish like her grandmother. Emily's innocent memory provided the clue that Michael's expensive resources had missed. Clara's connection to her community, her roots in the immigrant neighborhoods that remained invisible to the wealthy inhabitants of Chicago's Gold Coast. Michael found Clara on a Sunday afternoon at St. Augustine's Community Center in Little Village, her gray hair covered by a simple headscarf, as she ladled pozole into styrofoam containers for a line of families that stretched around the block. She wore the same gentle expression he remembered from the penthouse kitchen, but her movements carried a lightness that had been absent during her final months in his grandfather's employ. The community center's kitchen was a fraction of the size of the penthouse's culinary palace, equipped with donated appliances and mismatched pots, but it hummed with warmth and purpose that no amount of money could purchase. Clara looked up as Michael approached the serving window, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The month since her dismissal had weathered her face slightly, carved new lines around her eyes, but her hands remained steady as she continued serving soup to people who whispered "Gracias" and "Dios te bendiga" with the fervor of genuine gratitude. "Mr. Michael," she said finally, her voice carrying neither anger nor welcome, simply acknowledgement of his unexpected presence in her world. "Clara," he replied, and the name felt foreign on his tongue because he realized he had rarely addressed her directly during her months of service to his family. He had spoken around her, about her, but never truly to her, never with the recognition that she was a complete human being with her own story, her own dreams, her own dignity worth respecting. "We need to talk. My grandfather, he's not well. He's asking for you." The conversation that followed took place in a small office behind the community center's kitchen, surrounded by boxes of donated food and volunteer schedules written in both English and Spanish. Clara listened as Michael explained his grandfather's decline, the way Edward had stopped eating, stopped engaging with life, stopped being the man who had briefly flourished under her care. Her expression remained neutral, neither pleased by the vindication nor eager to gloat over the failure of her replacement. When Michael finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, her calloused hands folded in her lap like prayer. "Mr. Edward is a good man," Clara said finally, her words carrying the weight of months of intimate caregiving, of midnight vigils during illness, of small conversations over shared meals that had gradually revealed the lonely heart beneath the billionaire's public facade. But he is also a proud man. And proud men sometimes need to learn that money cannot buy the things that make life worth living. Her English, accented but precise, carried a wisdom that Michael's Harvard MBA had never taught him, an understanding of human nature that came from decades of service to others, of watching families from the shadows of their kitchens and living rooms. "Come back," Michael said, the words tumbling out with an urgency that surprised them both. "Name your price, whatever you want. Salary, benefits, a formal contract with pension plans and health insurance. I'll have my lawyers draft something immediately. My grandfather needs you and I." He paused, struggling with words that his corporate vocabulary had no framework for expressing. "I think I understand now what we lost when you left." Clara's response came not in words, but in action. She stood and walked to a window that looked out over the community center's small courtyard, where children played between folding tables where volunteers sorted donated clothing. "I don't cook for money, Mr. Michael," she said without turning around. "I never have. I cook because feeding people is my way of showing love, of making the world a little warmer for someone who needs warmth. Your grandfather doesn't need an employee. He needs someone who sees him as a person, not as a bank account with medical problems." The reunion happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in January, when Chicago's wind carried the promise of more snow, and Edward sat in his study staring at financial statements without seeing the numbers. Clara entered through the service entrance as she had hundreds of times before. But this time, Michael personally escorted her to the kitchen, carrying her simple canvas bag like precious cargo. Edward heard her voice before he saw her, drifting from the kitchen like a half-remembered song, and he found himself walking toward the sound, with more purpose than he had shown in weeks. She was standing at the stove, her back to the doorway, stirring something that filled the air with the scent of cumin and oregano, of memories and homecoming. Edward paused in the threshold, afraid that speaking might break the spell, might reveal this moment as another cruel trick of his failing mind. But Clara turned as if sensing his presence, and her smile was like sunrise after a long night, warm and genuine and completely without pretense. "I thought you might be hungry," she said simply, gesturing toward the pot on the stove. "I made your favorite, the beef stew with the little potatoes, the way my grandmother taught me." Edward felt tears on his cheeks, the first he had shed in months, and he nodded because words were inadequate for the relief flooding through his chest. Clara opened her arms, and the old man who commanded a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars collapsed into the embrace of a woman whose net worth could be counted in hundreds, finding in her warmth the wealth he had been searching for without knowing its name. The kitchen came alive again under Clara's gentle stewardship. The herb garden bloomed on the windowsill, tended with the same care she gave to Edward's medications and meals. The cookie jar filled with Emily's favorites, and laughter echoed off the marble surfaces as great-granddaughter and cook resumed their afternoon sessions of flowery chaos and sweet discoveries. Philippe, his pride stung by the obvious preference for Clara's simple cooking, departed within a week, muttering in French about the lack of appreciation for true culinary artistry. But Edward barely noticed his departure, too busy rediscovering his appetite for both food and life under Clara's patient care. Michael found himself spending more time at the penthouse, drawn by the transformation in his grandfather, but also by his own growing understanding of what he had almost destroyed through his corporate arrogance. He began eating meals with Edward, sitting at the kitchen island while Clara cooked, listening to stories about her grandmother's restaurant, about the recipes that carried the history of generations in their ingredients. "Food is memory," Clara told them one evening, as she demonstrated the proper way to fold tamales, her hands moving with dancer's grace as she shaped corn husks into perfect parcels. "When you cook with love, you're not just feeding bodies, you're feeding souls, creating connections that last long after the meal is forgotten." The transformation was subtle but profound. Edward gained back the weight he had lost, but more importantly, he gained back his engagement with the world around him. He began asking Clara about her family in Mexico, about her dreams for the community center, about the recipes she wanted to teach Emily before she grew too old to be interested in kitchen magic. Michael started contributing to the community center's food program, not through impersonal charitable donations, but by rolling up his sleeves and serving meals alongside Clara on Sunday afternoons, learning that true wealth came not from accumulating money, but from giving it away in service to others. Clara never returned to live in the penthouse. Instead, she established a routine that honored both her commitment to Edward and her calling to serve her community. 3 days a week, she cooked for the old man who had become like family, preparing the meals that sustained not just his body but his spirit. The other days belonged to the community center, to the families who lined up for her pozole and empanadas, to the children who learned her grandmother's recipes, along with lessons about dignity and service that no classroom could teach. On a warm spring evening, as Chicago's skyline glowed golden in the setting sun, Edward presented Clara with a deed to a small building in Little Village, not as payment for her services, but as an investment in the dreams she had shared during their quiet conversations. "I want you to have your own restaurant," he said, his voice strong despite his 87 years. "A place where you can cook with your heart for people who will appreciate what you're giving them. It's not charity. It's a business partnership between two people who understand that the most important things in life can't be measured in dollars." Clara's restaurant opened 6 months later, a modest establishment with mismatched tables and chairs bought from restaurant auctions, walls painted sunny yellow that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen in Mexico. The menu was simple, the comfort foods that had nourished her family for generations, prepared with the same love and attention she had given to Edward's meals. She named it corazon, Spanish for heart, because she knew that was the secret ingredient in every dish she prepared. The restaurant became a gathering place for the neighborhood, a spot where construction workers could get an honest meal for a fair price, where families celebrated quinceañeras with Clara's 3-layer cakes, where lonely elderly people found community over steaming bowls of menudo on Sunday mornings. Edward became a regular customer, arriving every Thursday for lunch, his chauffeur-driven car looking out of place among the pickup trucks and economy cars in the small parking lot. But inside, he was simply another customer, another person whose day was made brighter by Clara's cooking and her genuine care for the people she served. Emily, now 9 and wise beyond her years, spent summer afternoons at the restaurant, helping Clara with simple tasks and absorbing life lessons along with cooking techniques. "Remember what I taught you," Clara would say as they prepared vegetables together, her knife work still sure and efficient despite her advancing years. "Cooking is about more than following recipes. It's about putting your love into what you make, about understanding that every meal is a gift to the person who receives it. Never forget that your hands have the power to heal hearts, not just fill stomachs." Michael, transformed by his own journey from corporate arrogance to human understanding, established a foundation that supported community kitchens throughout Chicago, ensuring that women like Clara had the resources they needed to feed their neighbors with dignity and love. He learned to see wealth not as a destination, but as a tool, not as a measure of worth, but as a responsibility to lift others up. His grandfather's estate planning became less about tax shelters and more about legacy, about ensuring that Edward's fortune would continue to nourish communities long after the old man was gone. Years passed like seasons, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. Edward lived to 92, his final years colored by the warmth of Clara's friendship and the satisfaction of knowing his wealth had found its purpose in service to others. Clara aged gracefully, her hair growing whiter, but her hands remaining steady as she continued to cook for anyone who needed nourishment, whether of body or spirit. Her restaurant became a neighborhood institution, a place where food was secondary to the sense of belonging that permeated every corner of the sunny yellow dining room. The last time Michael saw Clara, she was teaching a group of young mothers how to stretch their grocery budgets while still providing nutritious meals for their families. Her voice was patient and encouraging as she demonstrated how to transform simple ingredients into feasts, sharing not just techniques, but the deeper wisdom that had guided her own journey from poverty to purpose. "You are not just cooks," she told them, her words carrying the authority of a lifetime spent nourishing others. "You are healers, teachers, artists. Every meal you prepare with love is a masterpiece. Every person you feed is blessed by your hands. Never let anyone tell you that your work is not important, because without you, the world would be a much colder, hungrier place." But Clara's story didn't end there, dear friend, because true stories of love and service never really end. They ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, touching lives in ways we may never know. The restaurant became more than just a place to eat. It became a beacon of hope in a neighborhood that had seen its share of hardship and struggle. Mothers brought their children there not just for the affordable bowls of pozole and fresh tortillas, but for the lessons Clara taught about dignity, about taking pride in honest work, about finding joy in simple pleasures. Sofia Ramirez was one of those children, a shy 10-year-old whose mother worked 3 jobs to keep their small family afloat after her father's deportation had shattered their world into fragments of loneliness and economic desperation. Sofia's mother, Isabella, had discovered Corazon during one of the hardest winters of their lives, when the heating bill had consumed most of their grocery money and she found herself counting coins to buy milk for her children. Clara had noticed the way Isabella lingered outside the restaurant's window on cold evenings, the way her eyes followed other families enjoying warm meals while she clutched the small bills that would have to stretch until Friday's paycheck. "Come in," Clara had called one particularly bitter February night, opening the door to the woman whose pride and poverty waged war in her dark eyes. "I made too much menudo today. It would be a shame to waste it." It was a gentle lie, the kind of compassion that preserved dignity while offering help. Isabella knew it was charity, but Clara's gracious fiction allowed her to accept it without the crushing weight of complete dependence. That night, Sophia tasted hope in the rich broth and tender hominy of Clara's soup, her small stomach finally full for the first time in days. What began as emergency aid evolved into something deeper. Isabella started helping with cleaning and dishwashing in exchange for meals, her efficiency and attention to detail soon making her indispensable to the restaurant's daily operations. Sophia would sit at a corner table doing homework while her mother worked, absorbing the rhythms of Clara's kitchen like a second education. She watched Clara handle difficult customers with patience, saw her slip extra food into containers for families who were struggling, witnessed the way the older woman's hands moved with unconscious grace as she transformed humble ingredients into meals that nourished more than just bodies. "You have good hands," Clara told Sophia one afternoon, as the girl helped roll masa for empanadas, her small fingers surprisingly adept at the delicate work. "Your touch is gentle but sure. That's important in cooking. You have to respect the ingredients, understand that they want to become something beautiful." Sophia blushed at the praise, unused to adults recognizing her potential for anything beyond academic achievement. In school, she was just another scholarship kid from the wrong neighborhood, smart enough to keep up but always aware of the economic chasm that separated her from her classmates' designer backpacks and family vacations. But in Clara's kitchen, Sophia discovered a different kind of intelligence, a wisdom that had nothing to do with test scores or college preparatory courses. She learned to read the mood of rising bread dough, to judge the perfect moment when onions shifted from raw to caramelized, to understand that cooking was a conversation between heart and hands that required no translation. Clara never spoke down to her, never simplified the complex chemistry of successful baking or the intuitive art of seasoning that came from decades of practice. My grandmother used to say that every woman carries a kitchen in her heart, Clara explained one rainy Saturday as they prepared for the lunch rush, her voice soft with memory. Some women discover it early, some never find it at all. But you, Mita, you were born knowing. I can see it in the way you handle the masa, the way you watch the pot to know when the beans are done. You have the gift. Sophia treasured these moments of recognition, storing Clara's words like precious coins against future days when she would doubt her own worth. The girl's transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Her shy silence grew into confident questions about technique and tradition. Her homework began reflecting the organizational skills she learned from watching Clara manage a kitchen during busy lunch hours. Her Spanish, limited by years in American schools, blossomed as she absorbed the culinary vocabulary of her grandmother's generation. Words like sofrito and cilantro that connected her to roots she had nearly forgotten in her family's desperate scramble for assimilation and survival. Edward noticed the child during his weekly visits, observing her quiet competence as she helped Clara with simple tasks, her serious expression as she absorbed lessons that went far beyond cooking. "She reminds me of you," he told Clara one afternoon as they watched Sophia teaching a younger child how to properly fold napkins. That same quality of caring about doing things right, not for recognition, but because the work itself matters. Clara smiled, seeing in Sophia's dedication an echo of her own childhood. The same hunger to learn that had driven her from her grandmother's tiny kitchen to the gleaming penthouse, and now to this sunny restaurant where love was the most important ingredient in every recipe. But not everyone appreciated Clara's influence on the neighborhood's children. Mrs. Davidson, the principal at Sophia's school, called Isabella to express concerns about her daughter's distraction from academic priorities. During parent-teacher conferences, she noted with barely concealed disdain that Sophia's standardized test scores, while still respectable, had shown a slight decline that correlated with her increased time at the restaurant. "Your daughter has college potential," Mrs. Davidson explained with the patronizing tone of someone convinced she knew what was best for other people's children. "But she needs to focus on subjects that will actually matter for her future. Mathematics, science, literature. Learning to cook tortillas isn't going to get her into Northwestern University." The criticism stung Isabella, who had sacrificed everything for her daughter's education, who cleaned office buildings at night and wealthy homes during the day so Sophia could attend a school with advanced placement classes and college counselors. She loved Clara deeply, appreciated everything the older woman had done for their family, but she also understood the harsh realities of social mobility in America. Education was the only ladder out of poverty that she trusted, the only currency that might buy her daughter escape from the cycle of minimum wage jobs and financial instability that had defined Isabella's own adult life. Sophia sensed her mother's conflict, felt the weight of expectations that pulled her between worlds, the academic achievement that promised a different kind of future, and the hands-on wisdom that filled her with deep satisfaction. At school, she was praised for her analytical writing about literature she had never seen reflected in her own life's experience. At the restaurant, she felt useful in immediate, tangible ways, feeding people who thanked her with genuine gratitude, learning skills that connected her to generations of women who had nourished their communities through times of hardship and celebration. The tension came to a head during Sophia's 8th grade year, when academic pressures intensified and her time at the restaurant became increasingly limited. Isabella, influenced by well-meaning teachers and guidance counselors, began insisting that Sophia spend her after-school hours in study groups and test preparation courses rather than learning what they dismissed as menial skills in Clara's kitchen. "You're too smart for this," she told her daughter one evening, as Sophia reluctantly packed away the apron Clara had embroidered with her name. "You have opportunities I never had. Don't waste them on things that won't matter when you're applying to colleges. Clara watched Sophia's spirit dim as the weeks passed without their afternoon cooking sessions, saw the girl's shoulders slump under the weight of academic expectations that seemed to dismiss everything she had learned about nurturing and service. The restaurant felt different without Sophia's eager questions and quiet presence, and Clara found herself saving stories and techniques she had planned to share, hoping for a return that seemed increasingly unlikely as the months progressed. The crisis arrived during Sophia's freshman year of high school, when the accumulated pressure of advanced placement courses, college preparatory activities, and her family's financial struggles finally overwhelmed the girl's remarkable resilience. She'd been working late into the night on essays and projects while her mother cleaned office buildings, surviving on vending machine snacks and determination when she collapsed during a particularly stressful week of final examinations. The school nurse called Isabella at 2 a.m, and the panic in her voice made it clear that exhaustion was only part of the problem. Sophia lay in the hospital bed looking fragile and young, her 15-year-old frame seeming to disappear into the white sheets and medical equipment that monitored her vital signs. The doctor's diagnosis was clear: severe malnutrition complicated by stress and chronic sleep deprivation. "She's been running on empty for months," he explained to Isabella with professional kindness but unmistakable concern. "Her body simply doesn't have the resources to sustain this level of academic pressure and emotional strain. We need to address not just her immediate health needs, but the lifestyle factors that brought her to this point." Isabella sat beside her daughter's bed, holding the thin hand that looked so much smaller than she remembered, and felt the crushing weight of her own choices. She had pushed Sophia toward academic success with the fierce determination of a mother who understood that education was the only weapon against a world that seemed designed to limit their opportunities. But, in her urgency to secure her daughter's future, she had forgotten to nourish her daughter's present, to value the things that brought Sophia joy and meaning beyond test scores and grade point averages. Clara arrived at the hospital carrying a thermos of caldo de pollo and a bag of still-warm tortillas, her face creased with worry, but her movements purposeful and sure. She had been contacted by Elena, the church secretary who served as the neighborhood's informal communication network, and had immediately closed the restaurant to come to Sophia's bedside. Isabella looked up as the older woman entered the room, and for the first time in months, her carefully maintained composure cracked completely. "I don't know what I'm doing," Isabella whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks as she squeezed Sophia's unconscious hand. "I thought I was doing everything right, pushing her toward the American dream, but I think I was killing her spirit. She was so happy in your kitchen, learning things that made her feel proud and useful, and I took that away because it didn't fit into some college admission counselor's idea of resume building." Clara set down her provisions and gently pulled Isabella into the kind of embrace that mothers give to daughters, holding the younger woman while she sobbed out months of accumulated fear and guilt. "You are a good mother," Clara said softly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of family struggles and triumphs. "You love your daughter and want her to have opportunities you never had. But sometimes loving someone means letting them discover what makes them feel alive, even if it's different from what we planned for them." They sat together through the night, taking turns holding Sophia's hand and sharing stories about their own mothers, their own struggles to balance survival with dreams. Clara talked about her grandmother's restaurant in Mexico, how it had been more than a business. It had been a community center, a place where families celebrated good times and found comfort during difficult ones. She never made much money, Clara remembered, smoothing a wrinkle in Sophia's blanket, but she was rich in ways that mattered. People trusted her with their hungers, their celebrations, their sorrows. She fed 3 generations of families, and when she died, the whole town mourned. That's a kind of success that can't be measured on any standardized test. Sophia opened her eyes as dawn light filtered through the hospital window, her gaze seeking Clara's face with the instinctive trust of someone who had always found warmth there. "I dreamed about empanadas," she whispered, her voice hoarse but carrying a hint of her old humor. "Golden ones, perfect ones, like the batch we made for Mrs. Rodriguez's anniversary party. They were so beautiful, and everyone was happy." Clara smiled and smoothed the girl's hair with gentle fingers that had comforted so many people over the years. The recovery was slow, requiring not just medical treatment, but careful attention to the emotional and spiritual factors that had contributed to Sophia's collapse. Isabella, chastened by how close she had come to losing her daughter to academic pressure, made the difficult decision to transfer Sophia to a smaller school that offered a more holistic approach to education. Clara suggested a charter school that emphasized experiential learning and community engagement, where Sophia's gifts for nurturing and service would be valued alongside traditional academics. At the new school, Sophia flourished in ways that surprised everyone except Clara. Her English essays about food and family drew praise from teachers who appreciated her authentic voice and cultural perspective. Her science projects exploring the chemistry of bread making and the nutritional value of traditional Mexican ingredients earned recognition at regional competitions. Most importantly, she began to see connections between her academic learning and her practical skills, understanding that intelligence took many forms and that her hands-on wisdom was as valuable as her analytical abilities. The restaurant became part of Sophia's formal education through an internship program that allowed her to earn credit while learning advanced culinary techniques and small business management from Clara. She kept detailed journals of recipes and customer interactions, documenting the oral history of dishes that carried family stories and cultural traditions. Her final project was a detailed business plan for expanding Clara's community outreach, including a proposal for cooking classes that would teach immigrant families how to prepare nutritious meals on limited budgets while preserving their cultural food traditions. Edward, now in his early 90s but still sharp and engaged, became one of Sophia's most enthusiastic supporters. He funded a scholarship program that would allow her to attend culinary school after high school graduation, but with the understanding that her education would serve the community rather than just her own advancement. "The world needs people who understand that success means lifting others up," he told Sophia during one of their conversations at the restaurant, his weathered hands steady as he sampled her latest creation. "Clara taught me that, and now she's teaching you. That's how wisdom passes from generation to generation." But Clara's influence extended far beyond Sophia's individual story. The restaurant had become a training ground for dozens of young people from the neighborhood, many of whom discovered their own talents and potential through the patient mentorship she provided. Marcus Williams, a 16-year-old who had been headed toward trouble before finding purpose in Clara's kitchen, went on to become a successful catering entrepreneur who specialized in fusion cuisine that celebrated both his African-American heritage and the Mexican techniques Clara had taught him. Lucia Morales started helping at the restaurant when she was 13, fleeing an abusive home situation and finding safety in the warm chaos of lunch preparation. Under Clara's guidance, she learned that her perfectionist tendencies, which had made her a target for her stepfather's violent outbursts, could be channeled into the precise artistry of pastry making. She eventually earned a scholarship to culinary school and returned to open a bakery next door to Corazon, creating a small business district that anchored the neighborhood's economic recovery. Each success story carried Clara's fingerprints, her quiet influence visible in the way these young entrepreneurs treated their employees, served their communities, and understood business as something more than just profit and loss statements. They had learned from her example that true prosperity came not from accumulating wealth, but from creating value for others, from using their skills to strengthen the social fabric of their neighborhoods. Michael often marveled at the ripple effects of his grandfather's investment in Clara's dream. The foundation he had established to support community kitchens had grown into a network of restaurants, food trucks, and catering companies that employed hundreds of people and served thousands of customers throughout Chicago's immigrant communities. But more than the economic impact, he He was amazed by the cultural transformation. The way Clara's approach to food and hospitality had created spaces where people from different backgrounds could find common ground around shared meals and mutual respect. The recognition came gradually, building like layers of flavor in a slow-cooked stew. Food writers began noticing the unpretentious excellence of Clara's cooking, the way her simple ingredients were transformed into dishes that satisfied both body and soul. The James Beard Foundation nominated her for an award recognizing outstanding community service, and food magazines started featuring Corazon in articles about authentic ethnic cuisine and grassroots social change. But Clara remained largely unmoved by external validation, focused instead on the daily work of feeding people and nurturing the next generation of community leaders. She had learned long ago that true success was measured not in accolades or media attention, but in the faces of satisfied customers, the progress of young people like Sophia and Marcus and Lucia, the gradual strengthening of neighborhood bonds that came from shared meals and mutual support. The restaurant's walls bore testimony to this kind of success. Photographs of weddings catered, graduation parties celebrated, fundraisers organized to help families facing medical crises or immigration challenges. Each picture told a story of community resilience, of people finding ways to support each other through the challenges of modern life, while preserving the cultural traditions that gave meaning to their struggles and triumphs. Emily, now a high school senior preparing for college, still spent summers working at the restaurant, her skills refined by years of patient instruction from Clara and her diverse team of young cooks. She had grown into a confident young woman who spoke fluent Spanish and understood the complexities of running a business that served both economic and social purposes. Her college essays about learning leadership through food service earned admission to several prestigious universities, but her plans remained centered on returning to Chicago to continue the work Clara had begun. "She taught me that cooking is just the beginning," Emily explained to her great-grandfather during one of their last conversations before his peaceful death at 95. "The real magic happens when you create space for people to connect with each other, when you help them remember that they're part of something bigger than their individual struggles. That's what Corazon does. It feeds hearts as much as stomachs." Edward smiled at his great-granddaughter's words, seeing in her the same understanding that had drawn him to Clara all those years ago. His final gift to the restaurant was an endowment that would ensure its continued operation and expansion, guaranteeing that Clara's work could continue long into the future. But more than financial security, he left behind a model of how wealth could be transformed into something meaningful, how privilege could be channeled into service, how the barriers between social classes could be dissolved through simple acts of recognition and respect. Clara aged gracefully, her hair now completely silver, but her hands still steady as she guided the restaurant through its second decade of operation. Sophia, now graduated from culinary school and running the day-to-day operations, had expanded the menu to include influences from the many cultures represented in their changing neighborhood, while maintaining the authentic flavors that had made Corazon legendary among Chicago's food lovers. The torch was passing, as Clara had always known it would, but the values remained constant. Every new employee learned not just cooking techniques, but the philosophy that food was a bridge between cultures, that hospitality was a form of healing, that small acts of kindness could accumulate into profound social change. The restaurant's training manual, largely written by Sophia with input from the dozens of successful graduates who had learned their craft in Clara's kitchen, emphasized these principles alongside recipes and food safety protocols. On Clara's 70th birthday, the neighborhood organized a celebration that filled 3 city blocks, with food trucks operated by her former students serving their signature dishes to thousands of neighbors, customers, and friends. The event was more than a party. It was a testament to the power of one woman's vision to transform not just individual lives, but an entire community's understanding of what prosperity could look like when it included everyone. Michael, now in his 50s and carrying forward his grandfather's philanthropic legacy, spoke at the celebration about the lessons Clara had taught his family. She showed us that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios, he told the crowd gathered in the restaurant's parking lot, his voice carrying across the microphone to people who represented dozens of nationalities and languages. It's measured in the lives we touch, the communities we strengthen, the young people we mentor into becoming better versions of themselves. Clara didn't just feed our bodies, she fed our souls, and in doing so, she taught us how to be fully human. The story could end there, dear friend, with celebration and recognition, with the satisfaction of seeing years of patient work finally acknowledged and appreciated. But Clara's real legacy wasn't in the awards or the media attention or even the financial success of her restaurant. It was in the countless small moments of connection, the quiet conversations over steaming bowls of pozole, the young hands learning to fold masa while absorbing lessons about dignity and service that would shape their character for decades to come. Late at night, when the restaurant closed and the neighborhood settled into quiet, Clara would sometimes sit at her favorite corner table and think about her grandmother, about the tiny kitchen where she had first learned that food was love made visible. She could almost hear the older woman's voice, approving and proud, whispering across the decades, "Mira, mija, look what you built from the seeds I planted in your heart. This is how we change the world. One meal, one student, one act of kindness at a time." The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning. In kitchens across Chicago, young cooks trained by Clara's students were learning to season their dishes with compassion as well as spices. In community centers and food banks, volunteers inspired by her example were creating new programs to address hunger and isolation. In classrooms and boardrooms, people who had been touched by her influence were making decisions based on the understanding that true success included everyone, not just those fortunate enough to be born into privilege. And so I ask you, dear friend, have you ever cooked for someone who never said thank you? Have you spent hours in the kitchen pouring your love into meals for people who took your efforts for granted? Have you ever felt invisible, unappreciated, like your work didn't matter? Tell me in the comments below. Share your story. Because every woman who cooks with her heart deserves to know that her efforts are seen, valued, and celebrated. If Clara's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the sacred nature of the work you do every day, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with another woman who cooks with love, who might need to be reminded that her hands hold the power to heal and nourish in ways that go far beyond mere sustenance. For more stories that honor the unsung heroes in our kitchens and homes, click the link to our podcast series on the left. Thank you for joining us on this journey of the heart, for understanding that the most important recipes are seasoned not with expensive ingredients, but with love, dignity, and the recognition that every person who feeds others is doing holy work. We'll see you in the next story, where we'll continue to celebrate the silent heroes who make our world warmer, one meal at a time.